I want to talk today about some research that we carried out as part of an impartiality review for the BBC. Now, this impartiality review we carried out between 2012-13, and we were asked to look at three areas: immigration, relationship, and Britain's relationship to the EU. And we examined about a month's coverage in 2007 and in 2012. We looked at a selection of television programmes: News at 10, Newsnight, Breakfast News, and on the radio, the Today programme, Breakfast Radio on 5 Live, and Newsbeat. And we also looked at online news as well. Okay. Now, within this, we looked at kind of three areas. We looked at the kinds of stories that the BBC covered, the patterns of source access, in other words, who were the main sources who were interviewed, who helped to frame the debate in BBC broadcast and also in online news, and we looked at the range of opinion. So it's only a month in each of these 2 years. So I have the caveat that it's a relatively limited sample, but when you actually see the results, they actually chime very closely with much of the other research that's been done in the area. And they also chime with many of the comments that have been made earlier by some of the previous both panelists and members of the audience. Okay. The research was part of a BBC attempt to move towards, to respond to what was called the Bridcut report, which argued that essentially in the 21st century, increasingly news media, that the kind of old-fashioned kind of balanced idea of a seesaw had become outdated because of the rise of social media, but also because of the fact that the political system was becoming increasingly fragmented. So the BBC essentially argued that rather than having a kind of left-right simple seesaw, the BBC should move towards more of what they described as a wagon wheel with multiple different forms of opinion. Now, when we looked at the coverage across the 2 years, one of the most striking findings on EU coverage is the dominance by political sources, and particularly Westminster sources. So, for instance, in 2007, about 65% of sources who were used were political sources, and that had risen to nearly 80% in 2012. And beneath this, you have media journalists, often you have reference to tabloid and the broadsheet press, members of the public, and also business private. The role of civil society, NGOs, charities is relatively low. And this particular kind of reporting, BBC's coverage of the reporting we find, was very, very much structured by the views of leading politicians. If we actually look and kind of drill down a little bit deeper into the data, you can see that by far the most referenced source was the Prime Minister, individual source. There was some more room in 2012 for the EU Commissioner, but primarily this is coverage that's structured by elite political sources. When we looked at the first period, which was in 2007 over the month, what we found was that the coverage across BBC News tended to be dominated by coverage of the Lisbon Treaty. There were, in broadcast news, some other stories that were covered, things such as regulation and the environment, some information on the European arrest warrant. But primarily, most of the coverage was focused around the various debates in Westminster on the Lisbon Treaty. And this, across broadcast, accounted for about 70% of coverage. And the coverage tended to focus on three core questions. Had Britain secured its red lines on opt-outs? Was the treaty a new agreement, or was it a repackaged version of the EU Constitution? And if it was an attempt to reintroduce a version of the Constitution, should a referendum be held to ratify it? And essentially, when we kind of drill down into that coverage, what you find is that virtually all the coverage on the Lisbon Treaty focuses on the positions of the main two parties who had diametrically opposed views. The Conservatives effectively were arguing that the opt-outs weren't secured, that it was just a repackaged version of the Constitution, and that there needed to be then a referendum, and the Labour Party opposed these particular views. Okay. Media reactions in terms of a kind of second layer of kind of source access, as we say, the media was also referenced fairly regularly, and when it did tend to be referenced, it was often Eurosceptic newspapers which were referenced, often in the context of the Today programme, talking about some of the key headlines from the press. Now, the key findings, as we say, are that opinion was closely centred on the perspectives of the two main parties. Right? There was very little space for other parties, very little space at this time in 2007 for the Liberal Democrats or for UKIP. There's very little space for civil society, unions, interest groups, even the voice of business. And there was very, very little information about the actual contents of the Lisbon Treaty. So most of it was very kind of procedural on the kind of fights between the two main parties. And there was very, very little informative coverage of the actual substance of the Lisbon Treaty. The EU tended to be framed as a threat that we needed to prospect and protect ourselves from, and there was very little relatively on the positive benefits. Labour also tended to take a very defensive position. So that what you found was that Labour tended to be arguing essentially that not that Europe actually threatened, but that, we were protecting our national sovereignty. There wasn't really kind of what we might think of as kind of full-throated advocacy of kind of further European engagement. When we looked at the coverage on online, there is a wider range of subjects that are covered on online news, though the Lisbon Treaty was still by far the most covered issue. Okay? This is partly to do with news values, and there's more flexibility on online news to actually cover a wider range of stories. Okay? When we looked at the 2012 sample, again we find is one story that's very, very dominant. In this case, it was coverage of the EU budget. There was a little bit of coverage on things such as criminal justice, banking reform, but again, it tends to be concentrating on one specific story because of the fact that there's a big bust-up between the two parties over that particular story. So it's drawn to the conflict and to the degree of disagreement and the kind of political fighting at Westminster. Okay. So here, as I say, in this second sample in 2012, a whole 80% of sources were political, and most of the coverage was focused on the Westminster debates. Okay, so you had the debates essentially about the EU budget, which pitted on one side the Conservative Party, the main bulk of the Conservative leadership, the kind of official position of the cabinet, and on the other side you had the Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative Party, which had joined forces with Labour to argue that in a time of austerity there should be a cut rather than a freeze to the budget. What we see at this time as well in 2012 is there's an increased movement for reporting of views which moved beyond a kind of Eurosceptic view towards a more kind of hard view about demanding a referendum and actually open discussion about actually leaving the EU. And this was something that wasn't there in the BBC coverage. You had seen how the kind of harder version of Euroscepticism, stressing a need to potentially leave the EU, had become increasingly prominent. What you also find is that most of the coverage, a very, very large percent of the coverage, as I say, involves the fighting. This was a fighting between Conservatives and Labour, but also Tory infighting. This is such a prominent aspect of coverage, particularly after there was a revolt in the House of Parliament where 53 Tory MPs voted against the leadership. So this became kind of a key area of subject, and the kind of infighting, the focus on the conflict, tended to overshadow a kind of wider debate about what the Lisbon Treaty actually involved. We found that the EU case tended to be made most prominently often by kind of EU officials. So, for instance, one of the strongest pieces of advocacy came from Richard Corbett, who made an argument that a lot of the money that was going into Europe was actually going into kind of increasingly towards important research and development rather than just into agricultural subsidies. And he also made the case, and you couldn't really find this anywhere else, that actually a lot of the money that Britain paid to Europe actually came back in the form of regional development aid. I live in Wales, and this is obviously a key issue in Wales, and the fact that it's one of the few pots of money that actually comes back in terms of regional development. But you would struggle really hard to actually find that argument on the BBC, as much of it was just focused on the kind of infighting between within the Tory party or between the Tory party and Labour. Okay? When we look at the coverage on online coverage, again, you tend to have a slightly wider range of topics that are actually covered. Okay, so the key kind of findings from this, I had to skate over this relatively quickly. In In 2012, the calls for an EU exit have become much more pronounced on BBC coverage, but it's the commonalities in coverage that are so startling. Reporting essentially the EU, we found on the BBC, is reactive. So it's not journalists going out and kind of hunting out stories. It tends to be focused on the activities of elites and when there's political infighting at Westminster. So it's very tied to what we call traditional news values, the movement of elite officials, the need to kind of personalise stories, and it's very, very conflict orientated. So the news media becomes very, very interested in Europe, primarily if it can be sold as a conflict between parts of the political establishment. Westminster voices are dominant, and in particular the views of the Conservative Labour Party are by far the most dominant stories. Most stories are told, as I say, through the prism of infighting at Westminster. From what the BBC producer said earlier on this morning, what the research suggests is this is probably because of the fact that European news is seen to have relatively low news value. It's not seen as being interested, there's not seen to be a big constituency amongst the general public who's interested. So in order to make a story newsworthy, it has to have some degree of big elite conflict. Much of the coverage tends to be relatively narrow and procedural, focused on things such as political meetings and negotiations. And the positive case for Europe tends to be framed almost exclusively in terms of economic benefits and political influence. There's very little room for sources outside the main two parties, and essentially what the coverage ends up reproducing essentially the debate at Westminster, and there isn't really a broader discussion of the wide variety of ways in which the EU actually affects British society.
Many people in this room may not like the editorial bias of the newspapers, but around that bias, the Daily Mail actually reports quite a lot of facts and provides quite a lot of information and argument about the pros and cons of being in the European Union. That said, I've got nothing to do with the Daily Mail. I've also got nothing to do with News UK newspapers. Sky News is, just like the BBC, subject to the same rules of impartiality and balance as everybody else, by law, regulated independently, in our case, by Ofcom. The first point I want to make is I'm sort of a little bit uncomfortable even speaking under the headline of how good is the British media reporting Europe, because I think good sort of implies a merit in reporting Europe and in reporting the European Union, and I don't think any mainstream news organisation does have an institutional loyalty. We don't have an institutional loyalty to the monarchy or the government of the day. Similarly, we don't have an institutional loyalty to the European Union or against it. Our function is to inform our viewers, give them information in the first instance that we think will be of value to them in leading their lives, and in the second instance that we think will be of interest to them. No more and no less than that. I would also argue, although I obviously don't speak on behalf of the BBC, that things have rather moved on from Mike Berry's report because, of course, we have a Conservative government preceded by a coalition government, and we have a great national debate at the moment about whether or not Britain should continue to belong to the European Union. I would plead guilty, I have to say, to, in covering Europe, subscribing to traditional news values. I do think a lot of news is reactive. It's how people respond to crises and issues of the day, and certainly we haven't, in this session so far, mentioned the cause of migration, but I would say that we've been covering the issue of migration for a year now on a daily basis, and that most of the people we speak to about that are European, but they're not British. They're all people, of course, coming in from the Middle East. And certainly in terms of what is going to be done about the problem of the mass flow of migration, it's pretty clear that actually the British government, British politicians, even British non-governmental organisations are on the sidelines. So most days, in the programme I present in the evening, Sky News Tonight, I find myself interviewing MPs or senior politicians or senior or interested parties from all across Europe, from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. And I think certainly we now speak to MEPs a great deal about the issues facing Europe. We don't necessarily speak to them in the context of the functioning of the European Parliament. I also plead guilty to covering Europe through conflict or through argument. In a sense, if there isn't a dispute about which way we should go forward certainly in live television, it's quite difficult to cover the issues of the day, and I don't see anything wrong with it. I mean, we're going to have a European referendum. There are different views on it, so we cover that. If we weren't going to have a European referendum, I don't think it would be particularly our job to beat around and try and have debates about the EU pro or con when that issue is not being presented to the public. I've been covering the European Union now for over 30 years. I lost count at 100 of the number of European Council summits that I've attended. We at Sky News, of course, and you're going to hear this afternoon from my colleague Robert Nisbet, who knows much more about the intricacies of covering Brussels, having been based there for a number of years. From the outset at Sky News, we have had a European bureau based in Brussels with a full reporters, producer, camera crew, satellite truck, and we now share that with our colleagues at TG24, Sky Italia's 24 news operation, and we've always agreed that European matters were very important. We do focus on those difficulties between a European vision of things and a British vision of things. That said, when we come to the institutions of the European Union, I don't see it as our job to uphold them or to report them because they're happening. Issues such as problems with the budget or decisions to take business decisions, we cover very thoroughly indeed. As you'll see at the moment, if you watch Sky News, a lot of our coverage of the European referendum issues is based around the impact on and the differing views of big business, of SMEs, of people in the city. And of course, Sky is a European-wide business with major operations in Germany, Italy, and the UK. And clearly, we spend a great deal of time dealing with European regulators. So we're not in any sense hostile to the European Union. Indeed, they tend to be very often rather more sensible than the sort of regulator shopping that goes on in this country when it comes to anything to do with investment by News International. I would just end by saying that there is a problem with the British government, but also a much greater problem in Europe in terms of their attitudes towards journalists. I used to see a lot of Jacques Delors when he was president of the Commission, who was a very upfront person, always ready to be interviewed and to give his opinions. I remember covering the 1989 European parliamentary elections in Brussels, which you may remember was the only election which Neil Kinnock's Labour Party ever won. And Jacques Delors had said that he would give interviews reacting to the wide European elections to all the members of the European Union. And then when Labour won, he's decided that he wouldn't give interviews to the British because he didn't want to embarrass Madame Thatcher, which resulted in myself and BBC colleagues pursuing Jacques Delors around the Commission premises until his bodyguards grabbed our microphone, ripped it apart with the immortal words, "Surely you wouldn't want to speak to Monsieur le Président when he doesn't want to speak to you," which I thought was sort of not really understanding how Anglo-Saxon journalism works. Things were slightly explained to me. The last interview I did with Jacques Delors, when I suddenly realised that because I was big and blonde, he had always assumed I was American rather than British. So I think there can be incomprehension going in both directions, and I think the institutions of the European Union, the split between the Parliament in Brussels and Strasbourg, the fact that we've now got 3 presidents to deal with, the fact that the Commission can't really make up their minds whether they're politicians or civil servants, does actually make getting the European Union to explain itself something that is a difficulty of itself. Regrettably, that style of European politics has now infected British politicians. David Cameron no longer gives open news conferences. He no longer gives extended interviews on European matters, whereas his predecessors Gordon Brown was a bit different, but Tony Blair, certainly back to Thatcher in my experience, did. So if you say, do we cover Europe well? I think we do. We approach Europe as a place which generates stories. Do we cover the European Union well? I think we do. Is our coverage of the European good, in inverted commas? I certainly hope not.
Thank you for inviting me today. I appreciate it. I think it's a very worthwhile event. I've been asked to talk about coverage of the UK in the British print media, and I shall focus on that, though I thought both the previous presentations were extremely interesting and insightful. There are about 4 or 5 points I want to make. The first is the dominance and importance of the British print media. I do believe that what is reported in the main newspapers does set the agenda for the media coverage generally. It is true, as Adam's just said, that both the BBC and Sky have their own news-generating devices, crews, journalists elsewhere. But I still think generally the tone and nature of the media coverage, the TV and radio media coverage, is set by the British print media stories that are run. That came out particularly sharply in Mike's presentations about the BBC. And even if things have changed in the short time since that research was covered, as Adam suggested, I don't believe it's changed that much in terms of the overall state of affairs which is there. I don't think the key issue is whether the British print media are for or against the EU, whatever that means, or even for or against a particular policy, like Britain joining the euro or Britain a constitutional amendment. I think it is the sense of what are the issues at stake in this current EU issue which tends to dominate. Which brings me to the second point, which is, in my view, the British print media tends to see a lot of the EU stories through particular prisms. And I just want to have a word on particular prisms that I think reflect the coverage which takes place. Probably the single most important prism is UK versus EU. Might use rather strong language in terms of things like war and so on and so forth, though it's certainly true that some parts of the British media do quite frequently refer back to the Second World War as the context of the discussion in which current discussions are taking place. And at one level it's a joke that they do that, but at another level I do think it has some impact on the way the debate is seen. Certainly British political leaders, and in particular British prime ministers, are very much judged as to whether or not they have beaten their European colleagues or not in any particular process. We obviously see that in the current negotiation that David Cameron has had with Mr Tusk and his other colleagues, Mr Juncker. But in fact, that's a far more general characteristic, I would say, of the whole way in which the issues are addressed. And that's reinforced, that particular view, through the prism, by a sense of UK weakness in the EU, which I would argue is completely ahistorical. I think major changes, such as the single market, such as the enlargement of the EU, were very much British agendas, and other major European countries didn't see them in the same kind of way. And even at the level of basic issues like the number of senior officials within the European Union who are British, at least until recently, it was certainly not the case that Britain was in a weak position in that. But that sense that we are weak against the Europeans is, I think, a dominant part of the prism. Also aspects of personality, and that's just a fact of what goes on in British media coverage generally. A good example was the Tony Blair as President of the European Union story, or as I would say, complete non-story, never a start, never a possibility in any circumstances. But it became quite obsessive in parts of the British print media, rather than actually quite important and interesting debates about what kind of presidency arrangements would happen and the leader-candidate approach that was taking place in the European Parliament leads and so on. Other aspects of prisms are the general one of EU arrogance or stupidity in dealing with general issues is an assumption that many of the British print media make. I don't think that's a criticism I'd make of the broadcasting media, by the way. I don't think that that is the stance from which they come. EU failure. Generally, the Eurozone being the most the penultimate example, the current one is refugees. Now, I'm very critical of the way the EU has responded to the refugee crisis, and I know that there are many criticisms that are justified of the way the Eurozone has developed. But I never thought that Greece would be stung out of the Eurozone. Many parts of the British print media thought that that is what, in fact, would happen in the process and regarded it as almost a fact that that would take place, but it didn't. I think the final prism, which is important, is it doesn't see the relationship between the UK and the rest of the EU as a reciprocal relationship, but very much as a one-way relationship. So there isn't much talk of the right of British citizens to go and move to Spain and live and retire in Spain, but the concentration's the other way around. Or if we have a story like today about cheap flights within the EU, which I think are a result of the EU's regulatory regime, that's seen as something that's out of order, and somehow none of the UK's rights, unquotes, will be changed in these areas. But it's a reciprocal thing. Another good example is telecoms and the various changes in the EU which reduced roaming charges throughout the EU. So I think those prisms are important. My third point is to reinforce what Mike said, is I think a lot of EU coverage is through the projection of UK political arguments and differences rather than looking at the issues more widely. I would say recently, and by recently I mean over some considerable period of time, projection of internal conservative political differences actually dominating the debate about the EU altogether. I will be partisan. I think some of the European conservative commentators don't provide particularly objective analyses of what's going on in the EU, but they're often taken as authoritative by parts of the British print media in a way which I think is completely wrong. The fourth point I want to make is that some parts of the British media are prejudicial, verging on virulent, in the way that they discuss these questions. Again, I wouldn't make the same point about the broadcasting media at all, except insofar as the broadcasting media tends to reflect what's going on in the print media. But as Adam correctly said, there is a regime of impartiality which both Sky and the other broadcasters are required to adhere to, and I think in general they very much try to adhere to those overall approaches. But those constraints aren't there for the British print media. And it's obvious that all the newspapers have got particular lines, but in some cases, if you accept the view that I'm taking, that they set the agenda, the virulence of the way in which papers like the Mail and the Sun at various times have sought to set the agenda about EU questions does infect the British political debate in my opinion, a very damaging way. I would also say it's self-evident that the dividing line between opinion and reporting, which is supposed to be sacred in many parts of the British print media, has been very substantially dissolved in some of the newspapers. Now, one can go through them and see where we stand. And by the way, I don't think it's just a question of Rupert Murdoch having a particular prejudice or whatever. I think it's very much more, a much more substantial issue about insiders versus outsiders. The British print media want to present themselves as the voice of the outsiders, the voice of the voiceless, the voice of the dispossessed against the establishment forces. And I think it's wrong to say it's a capitalist conspiracy or a Murdoch plot or anything of that kind. I don't think that's what's going on at all. And that's why a number of issues are addressed in the way they are. But as you go through the major parts of the British print media, FT, I would say, is relatively objective in the way that it covers things. Telegraph is a very good newspaper, but has a strong prejudice anti the EU. I don't myself think it will come to saying vote no when the referendum actually comes. I may be wrong about that. We'll see. The Times has obviously, maybe not obviously, has gone down market very substantially in the last 10 years, moving towards a Daily Mail style of coverage of life. And I think that is reflected in the way that they operate. Though, again, I don't think they will, at the end of the day, say leave the EU when it comes along. The Guardian is typical unfocused type of coverage on anything. Ditto the Independent. The Mail, I think, will come out, and I think is absolutely virulent about it. The Sun, again, you've got to be careful in predicting where the Sun goes. It goes with where it thinks the people are, and if it tends to think that there will be a majority for staying in, it will want to be on the side of the winners. My prediction is the Sun will say stay in. The Mirror will certainly stay in, and is not playing a major part in forming opinions on this debate very much indeed. My penultimate point is that I do think the British print media have influenced politicians' attitudes to the EU very substantially. They've been a big force leading key politicians to think we shouldn't get involved in reforms of the EU, which will mean we have a massive argument that we prefer not to have. The classic example was in the late 90s on Euro membership, issues of the changes in the EU constitution, issues about the role of the EU in dealing with the refugee crisis are all examples of this. And I think that's been a very unhealthy thing in British politics. I think British politicians should have been more independent, stood up more to what they perceived to be the media impact on where they were. It's one of the reasons why since about 2008 I've argued there was a strong case for an EU referendum, which I've always thought should be an in-out referendum, as this one is going to be, not any other issue, because I think that's the best chance of lancing the boil of the EU within British politics. And so my final point is, personally, I remain optimistic that the referendum will give a vote to stay in the EU. And as I said earlier in talking about the individual newspapers, I don't think there will be as predominantly get out of the EU, vote leave, as some people think at the moment. But I think we're in for a very rough period of a few months where the actual debate around these issues, the way the agenda is set by the media on these questions, will be very difficult for us all to deal with. But finally, I think the outcome will be a decision to stay in the EU, which will have the effect of reducing the impact of the British print media on EU matters in the coming years.
I'd like to start off by making a very bold statement, which is this. Some UK media coverage of the European Union is superb. I, and in this case my colleagues too, we're often impressed by the ability of the British media, whether it's in a friendly or neutral or hostile mode towards the European Commission, so whether it's making our own lives easier or more difficult, to sum up in a single sentence very complex issues and to do that in a way that does reach readers accurately. And when the UK media does get things wrong, or when colleagues in Brussels feel that it's got things wrong, it's not always the media that's wholly to blame for these three reasons. First, EU institutions, I think, and this has been recognised by those institutions, have often failed to communicate cogently. Second, as we've been hearing, Europe's highly charged role in national political debate in the UK is not of assistance in generating accuracy and clarity. It generates a lot of heat, not necessarily light. Third, there are genuine cultural differences that fuel misunderstanding between British journalists and some Europeans, both journalists and officials. I think Christina Marconi will speak about this in a bit more detail later, so I'll just briefly touch on a couple of things. British journalists who've worked both in Brussels and in the lobby here have said that they felt that some non-British colleagues in Brussels were much too prone to take what the Commission or other institutions said at face value, and to give the institutions too fair a wind. On returning to the UK, the same journalists have felt that many in the British media, far from giving Brussels a fair wind, were refusing to give Brussels a fair hearing. Much of this, I think, is actually about tone rather than substance. French and German newspapers have never in recent times been uncritical of the EU. They often criticise it from a very different angle than the British ones, but they have not been uncritical. And most UK media, and I stress most UK media, have not treated the EU differently than they treat any other story. But it's a fact that the tone of UK media is especially partisan, adversarial, and robust. And for that reason, the UK media is often feared, both here and abroad. And there are differences in working practices that can create mutual frustration. To give one very specific example, the European Commission does not usually circulate announcements or speeches before they are given. Most European journalists do not expect that, but British journalists do, and they get frustrated when it doesn't happen. That's a cultural difference. More generally, and again, as we've been hearing, the lobby here feeds daily on adversarial politics. Every ministerial speech, every shadow cabinet speech, every announcement has a party political purpose, which makes it conflictual and interesting. That's not the case in the European Union. And that can make EU speeches, EU announcements sometimes seem, and perhaps even be, boring and technocratic. Boring and technocratic should not be confused with useless or spurious. They're not the same things at all. It's also worth remembering that the Commission's press service caters for a press corps of 1,000 and many more thousands of journalists in the member states. There is not the situation we have here, where a lobby of 100 or so journalists enjoys an extremely privileged status vis-à-vis Downing Street and the UK government. So all of these things can lead to mutual incomprehension. Is it a bad thing to have vigorous scrutiny from the popular media? Well, never, and I don't think anyone in the Commission would argue that it is. All institutions need to be kept on their toes, and there is an argument, which we haven't heard here yet, but it'd be interesting to have a discussion on it, that the media sometimes going over the top is the inevitable flip side of a robust media that scrutinises hard. In that context, very interesting to note the soul-searching in Germany about the alleged initial reluctance of media there to report the recent incidents in Cologne. I cannot comment in any way on whether German journalists are guilty as charged there, but it's certainly unlikely that the UK media would hold back in circumstances like that. But however, and it's a very big but, to take a recent example, the argument that you need to have the bad to have the good cannot justify tirades about Eurocrats wanting to ban children from doing paper rounds based on a report that did not call for banning paper rounds and was nothing to do with the European Union anyway. That's an example from last week. And the word misleading is a very mild word for stuff like that. Going on to talk a little more about the kind of misleading stories that I think you see about the European Union. I'm not saying all of these, for the reasons I've explained, are always the fault of journalists or newspapers or broadcast media, but these are the kind of misleading stories that sometimes go out. The first type, I think, is the story based on a canard. Just a couple of examples. The first is that EU rules always mean red tape. Sometimes they might mean red tape, but there's a long way from that, from demonstrating that, from reporting on that, to assuming and allowing this to colour entire swathes of reporting that it's always the case. The whole point of many EU rules is to cut red tape. The entire concept of the single market is EU laws that replace or complement national rules and thus remove barriers to trade. So if you want to complete the single market, which the UK and the UK press often says it does, that will mean some new EU legislation, inevitably. And that's quite compatible with saying, as Juncker does, that some EU rules are too cumbersome and that the EU needs to be small on the small things. Another canard, repeated often, including on the Today programme last autumn, to the anger of some of my colleagues, and also some independent people here, is that the Court of Auditors does not sign off the European Commission's accounts. Yes, it does, every year. So it's quite legitimate to report that the court criticises some aspects of EU spending. It's fair comment to say that the EU should do better, but it's simply untrue to say that the court does not certify the accounts as accurate and reliable. It always has done in recent years. It is untrue to say that the court calls into question 100 billion euros of Commission spending, as one broadsheet newspaper reported. The court said this year that 4.4% of Commission spending, very roughly 7 billion euros, not 100 billion, had been affected by errors, many of them technical, errors that didn't prevent projects being delivered, although some areas were much more serious than that, of course. The second type of misleading story, after the canard, is the one with key facts omitted, key context omitted. The Court of Auditors case again. There are 3 facts very often omitted from such reports. The first is that much of the misspent money is recovered. The second is that most of the errors identified in the court's report are made by national authorities overseeing EU spending and not by Brussels, in inverted commas. The third, and very important fact, is that there is no evidence whatsoever that EU spending contains more errors than most national accounts. Indeed, a former head of the National Audit Office suggested exactly the opposite to a parliamentary committee in Westminster here. But the biggest media omission of all is simply the frequent failure to explain how EU laws are made by elected ministers and MEPs rather than faceless bureaucrats. It sometimes seems that not a lot of people know that, and that interviewers fail to challenge those who give the impression that there's some kind of Brussels bureaucratic behemoth handing down rules for fun. Finally, as it's getting near lunchtime, a little bit of levity to illustrate the third type of misleading EU story. This is a list, and everything on this list has 2 things in common, which no doubt you'll guess quite quickly. A-levels, it's an alphabetical list, 1 per letter of the alphabet. A-levels, bankrupt, the word, coffee drinking, unless moderate, double-decker buses, elections on Thursdays, firefighters' polls, gin in square bottles, herbal remedies, imperial measures, jam jars being reused, kilts being described as menswear, lollipop ladies' sticks, milk of magnesia, non-nappy wearing cows, off licences on weekdays, Peter Pan, the Queen on UK passports, rhododendrons, steam trains, toilets, British style, Union flags on meat packaging, violin strings made from gut, wood-burning ovens, xylophones, toys, yoghurt in schools, and yet there is one for Z. Zoo advertisements which fail to include images of elephants. Now, the 2 things that all of those have in common, as I'm sure you've guessed, is first that newspapers have said that the European Union was going to ban them, and second that they're all still with us. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Our job is to check claims we hear from politicians and the media and other actors in public debate, be they businesses, charities, pressure groups, the referendum campaigns, and to take them back to primary sources and to figure out whether they stand up. And when they don't, to ask people to correct the record. So you can imagine we've been fairly active in the debate on the European Union for some years, since we started in 2010, and I recognise a lot of the stories that Mark has just mentioned. But let me take you to the other end of that perspective for a second, to a room as grand as this, maybe 4 times the size of the spin room, of the TV debates between Nigel Farage and Nick Clegg in the 2014 EU parliamentary elections. Our team was there, all huddled around a table with laptops, live fact-checking the debates, as were probably 200 or more journalists from all over the shop, be they TV, online, or whatever. As the debate went on, you'd get regular emails from the Liberal Democrat team saying Nick's right, containing just a hyperlink, 1 to a 130-page PDF justifying whatever he just said. As it happens, Full Fact had the time to check these claims in advance and knew that the link he was sending us to actually said the opposite of what he'd said. And I'm very pleased that on the second debate he didn't repeat the claim. But put yourself in the shoes of the average journalist dealing with that kind of situation. Claims about the EU coming thick and fast. They are busy, they are generalists by and large, and they are working to tight deadlines. How on earth is the average journalist meant to make sense of the European Union? Firstly, the research available back in 2014 was pretty useless when it came to the core questions the public actually wants to know about. How many British jobs are dependent on the EU? What is the effect on the economy? What proportion of our laws are made in Brussels, etc., etc.? And I'm delighted, actually, that this project, which is hosting us today, has got off the ground, and the ESRC has realised that the EU really needs a concerted effort to fill in some of those gaps. There is still, in the UK, no institution you can go to which is known for both being expert on the European Union and attached to no side of the debate. And I think that gap is stark and very obvious when you compare it to, say, the role the Institute for Fiscal Studies has in fiscal policy. Then you get to the European institutions themselves, and Mark sort of hinted at the difficulty of getting useful information out of European institutions. I'm very grateful to the work that the European Commission in London does to explain things, to signpost, to be helpful in this regard, but it is one very small operation trying to make sense of a very large operation, and by and large, actually finding reliable information about Europe, its processes, its people, its policies and its policy making is very difficult. I'd go so far as to say that the European Union is willfully complex at points, and the Lisbon Treaty is probably the embodiment of that in hundreds of pages of dense legal prose. But what's really striking as a fact-checking organisation is actually that in the UK we have very robust mechanisms for dealing with reliable and unreliable information. So if we think about the two great goals of journalism from a sort of fact-checker's point of view, one is accuracy in itself, and the other is holding others to account for the accuracy of what they say. Now, journalism has many other ambitions beyond that, but those are the two that most closely relate to fact-checking. Accuracy itself is made very difficult, and I'm not convinced that we have done enough as journalists in the UK, and fact-checkers are a kind of journalist as well as a kind of researcher, to actually push for the kinds of accountability mechanisms that would help people make sense of the European institutions and the European unions. And therefore, those gaps play out into media coverage of the EU. Put another way, almost any institution I talk to will say the reason we don't have the right media coverage is we don't have the right media. Usually it's better to start looking in the mirror than blaming the journalists. Now we come to the referendum campaign, and one of the things we can say for sure about that is the campaigns will be reaching for emblematic examples of very complex issues, whether it's for £3,000 benefit to every household of EU membership, which has been pushed by Stronger In recently, not entirely credibly, or whether it's 70% of UK laws are made in Brussels. Those kinds of emblematic examples are going to be potent and central probably to the referendum campaign, certainly have been so far. And I wanted to take you through that proportion of law made in Brussels example. That came up heavily in the Clegg-Farage debates. Nick Clegg said very confidently it's 7% of UK law. Nigel Farage followed up, it's 70% of UK law. They could hardly have disagreed more. And neither of them was right. Now, the first thing to say about this is a nonsensical thing to be arguing about. Totting up the numbers of laws is a really odd thing to do. Counting a 500-page reform of the NHS as equivalent to 3 pages of technical gubbins about VAT is just a really, really strange thing to do. But if you must do it, broadly speaking, you have to think about 3 sets of things to count. One is Acts of Parliament, and if you count Acts of Parliament, then you'll probably get about 15%. You can get 7% if you take a slightly different time period, but 15% is probably a bit fairer. Then there's UK secondary legislation, regulations made by the UK government, and then there's regulations made by the European Union itself. And if you add all of those together, at the time it would have been fair to say at maximum 50%, at minimum 15% of UK law was in some sense, made in Brussels. And so we challenged Nigel Farage and Nick Clegg on this, and the 70% then came up from a slightly different source. Rather oddly, the Vice President of the European Commission decided to cite this 70% figure, despite the fact that you would have thought it went against her own argument. She was actually referring to something completely different, and it was all a bit confused. She was referring to the proportion of EU law which is co-decided by the European Parliament. But nonetheless, the 70% got credibility from almost the highest sources in the EU. The difference with the Vice President was that when we wrote to her asking her to correct the record, we got no luck, no engagement, no interest in doing that. So, with friends like this, does the European Union really need enemies? Now, of course, the thing is, in the UK media, the EU does have enemies. This is from the Leveson Inquiry Report. Articles relating to the European Union and Britain's role within it accounted for a further category of story where parts of the press appeared to prioritise the title's agenda over factual accuracy. He said there was clear evidence of misreporting of European issues, citing, among others, full facts evidence and the kinds of things Mark was talking about. I don't think it would be terribly controversial to repeat the same conclusion now, that titles agendas do frequently seem to overrule their commitment to accuracy in covering the European Union. But, as I say, I don't think that's the whole story. I also think that in making that complaint, we very often see oversimplification, yes, in the media reporting with its agenda, but also in the response to it. I've lost count of the number of times where the criticism of the British media for inaccurate coverage has been substantiated, as it were, or purportedly substantiated by an equally simplistic interpretation on the other side. And this leads me to my really big question about the accountability role of the British media at the moment. Are they actually sticking up for the average viewer, the average reader, and the average voter, who over the next few months is going to begin to start to pay attention and need to make up our minds about what we think? Or are we actually passive watchers of an argument between two powerful bodies, media organisations on one side, in particular press organisations, and the European Commission and political establishments on the other, in which voters are rather a sideline? And it's not entirely clear to me that that accountability role is wholly being fulfilled as well as it could be in what the press is doing and the questions the press is asking of the claims that are made both on behalf of and against the European Union. That said, I think almost the more fundamental point, and we'll hear more about it this afternoon, I'm sure, is that basically the job of the British media about the European Union seems to me to be describing the indescribable to the indifferent. And given that that's a pretty tough gig, I don't think they're doing that bad a job of it as much as is suggested.